Hey guys! Tonight, we're doing one of those stories that sounds dramatic on paper, but in real life was mostly slow, awkward, bureaucratic, and deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. So go ahead and dim the lights. Put your phone face down. Loosen your jaw. And let your thoughts drift somewhere quiet. Because tonight, we're talking about medieval witches. Not the flashy bonfires you've already imagined. Not the screaming crowds. Not the dramatic last words that never actually happened. We're talking about what came after the trials. After the accusations. After the paperwork. After the judges got bored and went home. Because the real punishment, as usual, was the rest of their lives. Now, when people picture medieval witch trials, they usually imagine one universal outcome. Accusation. Trial. Execution. End credits. But history, in its usual unhelpful way, preferred a messy middle. Many accused witches were not executed. They were released. Or imprisoned. Or sent home with a list of humiliating conditions and a reputation that followed them forever. Which, in some ways, was worse. Because at least death was a conclusion. This was just ongoing. So let's start gently. With the women who were acquitted. Or at least, officially found not guilty. Which sounds comforting. But medieval justice had a very flexible definition of comfort. Imagine you've been accused of witchcraft in a small European village sometime around the 14th or 15th century. You've been questioned for weeks. Maybe months. Everyone you know has heard rumors about you talking to yourself. Or owning a cat. Or being slightly too good at remembering herbal remedies. Eventually, the court decides there isn't enough proof. No demon sightings. No flying reports. No neighbors willing to swear under oath that you turned their butter sour on purpose. So the judge clears his throat. Declares you innocent. And sends you home. Of course he does. You return to your village. Where everyone remembers the accusation. No one remembers the acquittal. And your social standing is now somewhere between untrustworthy and actively cursed. Neighbors stop borrowing tools from you. Children are told not to speak to you. Livestock mysteriously avoids your property, or so people claim. And every time something goes wrong in town, a late frost, a sick baby, a bad harvest, someone glances in your direction. Just briefly. Just enough. Many acquitted women were forced to swear public oaths. Promises to avoid certain behaviors. No healing practices. No charms. No muttering. No gathering alone with other women, because that apparently looked suspicious now. Some were ordered to wear identifying clothing. Nothing dramatic. Just a scarf. Or a badge. Something small enough to seem reasonable. But visible enough that everyone knew. It was medieval social probation. With no end date. And if you were accused again, well, Second chances were not really a thing. Now let's float gently over to the women who were convicted, but not executed. Because yes, that category existed too. Execution was expensive. It required witnesses, officials, wood, time, and paperwork. And medieval courts, much like modern ones, loved cheaper alternatives. So instead of death, some convicted witches were sentenced to imprisonment. Which sounds official. Until you remember what medieval prisons actually were. Most towns didn't have prisons as we imagine them. They had holding cells, basements, church storage rooms, occasionally a tower that leaked. Prisoners were not fed by the state. They were fed by family. If family felt like it. And if family believed you deserved it. So convicted witches often survived on scraps brought by reluctant relatives. Or on charity. Or not much at all. Some spent years locked away. Not because their sentence required it. But because no one bothered to release them. Others were eventually let go. Older. Weaker. And very aware that they had no legal protection left. Then there were the women sentenced to penance. This was a favorite of church courts. It looked merciful. And sounded spiritual. Penance could include long pilgrimages, public confession, fasting, daily prayers, or standing barefoot outside the church while townspeople filed past. Slowly. Judging you. Silently congratulating themselves for not being you. Some women were required to confess repeatedly. Even after release. As if witchcraft were a habit you could relapse into. Like medieval nicotine. Others were ordered never to marry. Never to practice midwifery. Never to live alone. Which, conveniently, made survival extremely difficult. And then there were the convents. For many accused women, especially younger ones, forced religious life was considered a neat solution. You were removed from society. Placed under supervision. And given something useful to do. Of course, convent life was not a peaceful retreat. It was structured. Strict. And permanent. Once inside, these women rarely left. Their identities slowly dissolved into routine. Prayer. Work. Silence. Not because they wanted holiness. But because the alternative was worse. Now let's pause gently here. And acknowledge something uncomfortable. Most accused witches were poor. Elderly. Widowed. Disabled. Or socially isolated. When trials ended, nothing improved those conditions. In fact, they usually worsened them. A woman released after trial often lost access to communal resources. No more shared ovens. No shared wells. No mutual aid during hard seasons. Which meant starvation was common. Not dramatic. Not immediate. Just gradual. Some women became wanderers. Moving from town to town. trying to stay ahead of rumors, living off temporary work, or charity. This made them more suspicious, which led to more accusations, which led to more trials. Because why not double down? Now let's gently introduce one of our recurring themes tonight. The problem of memory. Medieval communities had very long memories, and very short attention spans for nuance. Once someone had been accused of witchcraft, their name stayed on record. Literally. Many towns kept lists, and lists have a way of resurfacing. During later moral panics, during bad harvests, during outbreaks of illness. So women who survived early trials often found themselves accused again years later. Older, more tired, less able to defend themselves, and courts were less forgiving the second time around. Now let's drift into a slightly different category. The women whose trials technically ended, but whose punishment never did. Some accused witches were released into the custody of male relatives, husbands, brothers, sons. This was presented as mercy, and sometimes it was. Other times, it simply transferred power. A woman labeled as spiritually dangerous became legally fragile. She could be monitored, controlled, punished privately. And history, being what it is, doesn't leave us many records of how that turned out. But silence tends to speak loudly. There are court documents referencing women who died shortly after release. No details. No investigation. Just a note. Now let's gently step back and talk about reputation. Because reputation, in medieval life, was currency. Once yours was damaged, you lost access to credit, to marriage prospects, to legal trust. Some women tried to rebuild. They moved, changed names, cut ties. Others stayed, and learned to shrink. They spoke less. They helped less. They avoided attention, which, ironically, sometimes made people more suspicious. Because confidence was expected, and silence looked like guilt. Now let's take a slow breath here. Because none of this happened quickly. Witch trials were long. Aftermaths were longer. Lives were spent under quiet observation, under conditional tolerance, under the constant awareness that any misstep could restart everything. And then there were the children. Accused witches' children carried stigma. Daughters especially. Girls raised by accused women often struggled to marry, or were assumed to be dangerous themselves. Sometimes accused simply by association, which meant the consequences of a witch trial could last generations. Without a single execution. Just paperwork, memory, and social inertia. And that's where we'll pause for tonight's first stretch. In the next part, we'll float into specific regions. Germany, France, England, and how different legal systems produce different kinds of suffering. Same accusations, different flavors of misery. But for now, just let your thoughts drift. Because history rarely screams. Alright. Let's gently drift back in. If you fell asleep during part 1, that's perfect. That means it's working. If you didn't, don't worry, medieval bureaucracy will take care of that shortly. Now, one important thing to understand about medieval witch trials is that where you were accused mattered almost as much as why. Europe didn't have one unified system of justice. It had a patchwork of local courts, church courts, secular courts, and the occasional guy with a seal who was very confident about his opinions. So tonight, we're going to float across regions. Not quickly. No excitement. Just a slow tour of how different places handled witches after the trials ended. Same fear. Same superstition. Different administrative flavor. Let's start with the German-speaking regions. Because, of course, that's where things were extra. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't really holy. Wasn't really Roman. And definitely wasn't unified. It was hundreds of small territories, each with its own laws, judges, and favorite ways to ruin someone's life. In many German towns, witch trials produced a large number of conditional releases. Women were let go, but only after agreeing to strict behavioral rules. No traveling alone. No practicing healing. No attending gatherings without permission. No speaking publicly about the trial itself, because that made authorities uncomfortable. Some women were ordered to report regularly to church officials. Just to check in. Just to confirm they were still behaving like a non-magical person. Imagine having to periodically prove you were not secretly flying at night. Very relaxing. And then there were the oaths. German courts loved oaths. Oaths to God. Oaths to saints. Oaths sworn on relics. Breaking an oath didn't just restart your case. It made you a liar and a witch. Which, legally speaking, was a downgrade. Many released women lived under what we'd now call community surveillance. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious behavior. Which, conveniently, included almost anything. Talking to animals. Avoiding people. Being friendly. Being unfriendly. Having opinions. Now let's gently slide west into France. France had a stronger central legal tradition, especially in later medieval periods. Which meant fewer chaotic local trials, but longer-lasting consequences. French courts often imposed civil death. This didn't mean execution. It meant you were legally alive, but socially erased. A woman found guilty, or even strongly suspected, could lose the right to own property. To testify. To make contracts. She existed. But legally, she was background noise. Some women were placed under house arrest. Not formally. Just informally encouraged not to leave town. Others were sent away. Banished. which sounds dramatic, but usually meant walking until you found somewhere willing to tolerate you. France also leaned heavily on public shame. Formerly accused witches were often required to attend church services in specific places. Front rows. Visible spots. Because repentance, apparently, worked best when everyone could see you doing it. Now let's drift over to England, where witch trials were fewer, quieter, and somehow still unpleasant. English common law was more skeptical of witchcraft claims, at least on paper, which meant fewer executions, but not necessarily kinder outcomes. In England, many accused witches were acquitted, which sounds good, until you realize acquittal didn't restore reputation. Women returned home to villages where everyone still believed the accusations. And English villages were small. Very small. Some women were driven out informally. Neighbors refused to trade with them. Landlords declined to rent to them. Church communities ignored them. No decree needed. Just social pressure. English records show women who survived trials living for years on parish charity. Officially poor. Unofficially distrusted. And once you were dependent on charity, you were watched even more closely. Because gratitude was expected. Silence was expected. Compliance was expected. Now let's float briefly into Scotland. Because Scotland had opinions. Scottish witch trials were intense. But after conviction, punishments varied. Some women were imprisoned indefinitely. Some were released after confession. And some were forced into public repentance rituals that lasted months. Scottish Kirk sessions kept detailed records, which meant former witches were never really forgotten. Their names stayed in the books. And books, as we know, do not forget. Now let's pause gently and talk about men. Because yes, men were accused of witchcraft. Not often. But occasionally. And what happened to them afterward was different. Men accused of witchcraft were more likely to be associated with learned magic, alchemy, astrology, books. If acquitted, men often returned to life with fewer social consequences. Their reputations could recover. Sometimes even improve. Because a man dabbling in forbidden knowledge was curious. A woman doing the same thing was dangerous. Of course he was. Now let's return to the women. Specifically, older women. Elderly accused witches were often released simply because no one wanted to deal with them. They were sick. Weak. Close to death anyway. Courts let them go. Communities tolerated them. But care? Support? Not really. Many died quietly within a few years. Recorded only as formerly suspected, which is one of history's colder labels. Now let's talk about something that rarely gets attention: healing. Many accused witches were local healers. Midwives. Herbalists. After trials, these women were often banned from practicing. which left communities without medical knowledge. Births became riskier. Illness went untreated. And when things went wrong, people blamed the absence of magic, or suspected the women were secretly practicing again. Because why not blame them twice? Some women continued healing in secret. Quietly. Carefully. If discovered, they faced renewed accusations. This time with prior records, which courts loved. Now let's gently drift into the emotional aftermath. Survivors of witch trials did not leave diaries saying, "I am traumatized." But court records mention changes. Women described as withdrawn, silent, anxious. Some developed what we'd now call depression, or paranoia, which, tragically, made them seem more suspicious. Because calm innocence was expected, and emotional damage looked like guilt. Now let's float over to remarriage. Women accused of witchcraft rarely remarried. Widows stayed widows. Young women stayed single. And single women were vulnerable, which made them suspicious, which restarted the cycle. Some women married far below their previous status. Men willing to take the risk. Men with little to lose. These marriages were rarely happy, but they were survival. Now let's talk about time. Because time did not heal these wounds. It preserved them. Years later, during new witch panics, authorities often returned to old records. Names resurfaced. Women who had lived quietly for decades found themselves accused again. Older. Less able to defend themselves. And courts were less patient the second time. Now let's slow down. Take a breath. Because all of this happened without fire. Without spectacle. Just long lives lived under suspicion. And that's the part that history often skips. Because it's not dramatic. It doesn't end cleanly. It just continues. Hey guys. Tonight, let's slow everything down. Lower the lights a little. Put the phone on the nightstand. Let the room go quiet in that soft, end-of-day way where nothing important is expected of you anymore. Because tonight, we're talking about royal mistresses. Not the glamorous oil painting versions. Not the dramatic love stories. But what happened after the king died? After the crown passed on. After the court stopped pretending. After affection lost its political value. And as you might guess, it usually didn't end well. Now, royal mistresses existed in a strange historical space. They were unofficial, unprotected, and deeply involved in systems that were very happy to forget them the moment it became convenient. While the king lived, they might have rooms, jewels, servants, influence. After his death, they often had a suitcase problem, and very little else. So let's begin gently. In medieval Europe, where monarchy was sacred, marriage was political, and mistresses were tolerated. Barely. Most kings had mistresses. This wasn't scandalous. It was expected. Marriage was for alliances. Mistresses were for affection, boredom, ego, or midlife crisis management. Sometimes all four. And while the king was alive, the court adjusted around her. She might receive gifts, titles, land grants. Everyone smiled politely, through gritted teeth. But the moment the king died, everything shifted. The first thing that usually happened was eviction. Not dramatic, not emotional, just administrative. A new king, a new queen, a new household. And suddenly, the woman who once lived close to the center of power was told she no longer belonged anywhere near it. Records show former mistresses given a few days, sometimes hours, to leave royal residences. No negotiations. No sentimental speeches. Just, please vacate the room. And where did they go? That depended on three things. How powerful their family was, whether they had surviving children, and how vindictive the new regime felt. Let's talk first about the luckiest ones. Because there were a few. Some royal mistresses were quietly pensioned off. They received annual payments, small estates, or religious stipends. This usually happened when the mistress came from a noble family the crown still needed. Politics over spite. These women often retired into obscurity. Country estates, minor convents, quiet lives. Not glamorous, but survivable. They lived long enough to become footnotes, which, historically speaking, is a win. But most mistresses weren't that lucky. Many were sent back to their families, sometimes unmarried, sometimes pregnant, sometimes with children everyone pretended not to recognize. Returning home was awkward. Your family had enjoyed the benefits of your position, the gifts, the influence, the prestige. Now you returned, with none of that. And worse, with a reputation. Families often hid former royal mistresses away. In rural estates. In religious houses. Anywhere distant from polite society. Because being associated with royal intimacy was only impressive when the king was alive. After death, it was embarrassing. Now let's float over to the women who had children. Because this changed everything. And also, nothing. Royal bastards were common. Kings acknowledged them when convenient. Ignored them when inconvenient. When a king died, his acknowledged illegitimate children were sometimes granted titles or incomes. Sometimes. But their mothers? That was a different story. Once the king was gone, the mistress lost her primary protection. She could no longer claim influence. Only memory. And memory does not hold legal power. Some women tried to leverage their children's status. Petitioning courts. requesting support. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the new king, often a half-brother to the child, was feeling generous. Other times, requests were denied. Quietly. Efficiently. Because why maintain reminders of your father's poor impulse control? Many former mistresses spent years petitioning, writing letters, asking for what they believed had been promised. History preserves some of these letters. Polite, restrained, carefully worded, and unanswered. Now let's gently shift toward the darker outcomes. Some royal mistresses were imprisoned after the king's death. Not for crimes. For convenience. New queens often wanted rivals removed completely. Out of sight. Out of conversation. Accusations appeared. Immorality. Corruption. Political manipulation. Sometimes these charges had merit. Often they didn't. But they served a purpose. Confinement didn't have to be brutal. Just permanent. A tower. A convent. A guarded estate. You were alive. But you were done. Now let's pause and talk about queens. Because they matter here. Queens often endured mistresses quietly while their husbands lived. Because power dynamics were unfavorable. But after death, oh, that was their moment. New queens. Dowager queens. Queen mothers. They finally had authority. And they used it. Former mistresses were removed from court immediately. Their allies dismissed. Their properties reassessed. Sometimes their letters were intercepted. Their movements monitored. It wasn't revenge. It was housekeeping. Now let's drift to France. Because France was particularly talented at turning former mistresses into historical cautionary tales. French royal mistresses often wielded real influence while their kings lived. They advised. They mediated. They interfered. Which meant when the king died, there was a line of people waiting to undo them. Some French mistresses were forced into convents. Not as punishment. As containment. You could not influence politics from behind cloister walls. At least not easily. Others were stripped of titles and income, leaving them dependent on relatives who resented them. A few were exiled entirely. Sent abroad. Out of sight. Out of memory. England was quieter. More subtle. And just as effective. English mistresses often faded quickly after royal deaths. Their names vanish from records. Which usually means poverty. Without royal favor, there was no protection. No legal leverage. Some married hastily. Men willing to accept the baggage. Others never married at all. And unmarried women with past royal connections were problematic. Now let's gently talk about age. Many mistresses were young when they entered royal relationships. Teenagers. early 20s. By the time the king died, they might still be young, but emotionally worn. Their future had already peaked. And society was not kind to women whose best years were behind them, especially when those years were spent inconveniently close to power. Some former mistresses lived long lives. Quiet. Marginal. Others disappeared entirely. Which brings us to something important. History remembers kings, queens, wars. It forgets women who no longer mattered politically. Former royal mistresses often slip out of the record because no one bothered to keep writing about them. They stopped being useful. Now let's slow this down even more. Imagine waking up one morning. The king is dead. The court is silent. Your room feels temporary. Your jewelry is still there. For now. Your servants are polite, but distant. And you know, without anyone saying it, that your time is over. No announcement. No closure. Just the slow understanding that affection has an expiration date. And yours has passed. In the next part, we'll look at specific women. Named mistresses. Recorded lives. Women who went from royal bedrooms to convent cells, to quiet estates, to complete obscurity. For now, just let the thought drift. Because royal power was loud. But losing it. Alright. Let's drift back in. If your eyes got heavy near the end of part 1, that's exactly the correct response. Royal mistresses did not get dramatic endings. They got slow fade-outs. And tonight, we're leaning fully into that energy. Now, in this part, we're going to stop speaking in generalities and start meeting actual women. Real names. Real lives. Real disappointments. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just a calm walk through what happened when royal affection expired. Let's start in France. Because France treated royal mistresses like seasonal furniture. Useful for a while. Then quietly replaced. One of the most famous examples is Agnes Sorel, mistress to King Charles VII of France. She's often remembered as glamorous, fashion-forward, confident. She introduced low-cut dresses to court. Because of course she did. While Charles lived, Agnes was protected. She had land, income, influence. Courtiers tolerated her. Barely. But when she died before the king, her position showed exactly how fragile it was. Her enemies circled immediately. Her children's future became uncertain. Her memory was carefully managed. And this is important, even dying early didn't protect her legacy. Her daughters were married off quietly. Absorbed into nobility. Their mother mentioned as little as possible. Because mistresses were useful. But not respectable. Now let's move forward a bit to Madame de Montespan, mistress of Louis XIV. Yes, that Louis XIV. The Sun King. excessively confident, fond of mirrors. Montespan enjoyed extraordinary power while Louis favored her. She had influence. She had apartments at Versailles. She had opinions. She also had enemies. Many. When Louis eventually withdrew affection, slowly, awkwardly, Montespan didn't fall off a cliff. She slid. Her access was reduced. Her voice mattered less. Her presence became inconvenient. By the time Louis died, she was already socially isolated. Retired. Living in semi-exile. Her later life was spent deeply religious. Quiet. Almost apologetic. Not because she suddenly became devout, but because repentance was the only socially acceptable ending for a former mistress. Let's float over to England now. Because English royal mistresses tended to vanish faster. Take Alice Purse, mistress to Edward III. While Edward lived, Alice was powerful. She owned property. She appeared in court. She made enemies. Many enemies. When Edward died, those enemies moved quickly. Of course they did. Alice was accused of corruption. Stripped of property. Banished from court. She fought back. Legally. Persistently. And here's the interesting part, she actually regained some of her property later. Which makes her an exception. But even then, she never regained status. She lived out her life fighting for scraps of what she once had. Which, honestly, is one of the better outcomes. Now let's slow things down further and talk about convents. Because convents show up a lot in these stories. For royal mistresses, convents were a perfect solution. They removed the woman from society. Without executing her. Without scandal. You could frame it as spiritual reflection. A choice. A calling. It wasn't. Many women were placed in convents against their will after a king's death. Not as punishment. As containment. Inside, life was structured. Quiet. Monitored. You weren't suffering. You just weren't living the life you had planned. Some women accepted it. Others resisted quietly. But resistance inside a convent looked like silence. And silence rarely leaves records. Now let's talk about pregnancy. Because timing mattered. If a mistress was pregnant when the king died, her situation became even more fragile. A child born after the king's death was politically awkward. Was it legitimate? Was it acknowledged? Should it be supported? Often the answer was, not really. Some women were pressured to give up children. To relatives. To religious institutions. Others raised them quietly. Without support. Royal blood did not guarantee royal care. Now let's drift toward dowager queens. Because once again, queens mattered more after death. Dowager queens often controlled access to the new king. And they remembered everything. Former mistresses were removed swiftly. Not with drama. With efficiency. Their servants dismissed. Their letters intercepted. Their influence erased. It wasn't personal. It was political hygiene. Now let's move south for a moment, to Spain. Spanish courts were outwardly more moral. Publicly pious. Privately, flexible. Mistresses existed. But discretion was everything. After a king's death, Spanish mistresses were often erased almost completely. Records minimized. References removed. Some were married off quickly. Others sent to distant estates. The goal was silence. And Spain was very good at silence. Now let's talk about something quieter still, aging. Many royal mistresses outlived their kings by decades. Which sounds fortunate. Until you consider what that meant. They lived long lives remembering a peak that would never return. Watching younger women replace them. Watching courts forget them. Their later years were often marked by financial anxiety, health problems, and isolation. Some became deeply religious. Not always out of belief, but because religion offered structure when society withdrew. Others clung to past status, signing letters with former titles, mentioning long-dead kings, which only reminded people how irrelevant they had become. Now let's pause gently, because there's something important here. Royal mistresses were never meant to last. They were temporary by design. Their power came entirely from proximity. Not legitimacy. Not law. So when proximity ended, so did everything else. They were not villains. They were not heroines. They were women navigating systems that offered opportunity, with no exit plan. And history, predictably, did not care how they landed. Hey guys. Tonight, let's do something very calm, very slow, and very quietly depressing in a historical way. Go ahead and dim the lights. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. You don't need to remember anything from this. You just need to let it gently exist in the background. Because tonight, we're talking about medieval peasant women. Not queens. Not mistresses. Not anyone with servants or leisure or portraits. Just women whose lives were built out of routine, repetition, and exhaustion. And somehow, never ended. Now, when people imagine the Middle Ages, they usually picture castles, armor, and kings with questionable hygiene. But for about 90% of the population, life happened nowhere near a castle. It happened in fields. In huts. In kitchens that doubled as bedrooms. And for peasant women, life was less a story and more a schedule. So let's start at the beginning of the day. Which was early. Very early. Peasant women woke up at dawn. Not because of discipline. But because daylight was useful. And candles were expensive. Sleep happened when it could. On straw mattresses. shared with children, sometimes animals, because warmth mattered more than personal space. You didn't wake up refreshed. You woke up functional. Hopefully. The first task was usually fire. Because without fire, nothing else worked. You needed heat for food, for warmth, for light. So you checked the embers, blew gently, added fuel. And if the fire had gone out overnight, that was a problem. Because restarting it meant friction, time, effort, already tiring. And the day hadn't even started. Next came water. Peasant women fetched water daily. From wells, streams, communal sources. Buckets were heavy. Paths were muddy. And winter made everything worse. You carried water because everything needed it. Cooking, cleaning, animals, children. There was no running water. No shortcuts. Just repetition. Then food preparation. Bread was the center of life. Literally. Most peasant women baked bread several times a week. Grinding grain by hand. Kneading dough. Waiting. If you messed it up, you wasted precious resources. So you learned early. Usually as a child. Girls were taught domestic labor from a young age. Not gently, but practically. By adolescence, you already knew how to cook, clean, spin wool, tend animals, and manage children. Because you had been doing it for years. Now let's talk about clothing. Peasant women made clothes. Repaired clothes. Adjusted clothes. Nothing was thrown away. Fabric was valuable. Dresses were simple. Layered. Heavy. Fashion was not a concern. Durability was. And yes, clothes were worn until they disintegrated. Then repurposed. Then patched again. Laundry was labor-intensive. Water. Scrubbing. Drying. There were no days off for cleanliness. Or anything else. Now let's float gently into farm work. Peasant women worked the fields. A lot. Despite popular belief, farming was not men's work. It was everyone's work. Women planted, harvested, weeded, carried loads. Pregnancy did not excuse you. It just slowed you down slightly. Women often worked until childbirth, rested briefly, and returned to labor soon after. Because food production didn't pause. And neither did rent. Now let's talk about marriage. Most peasant women married young. Late teens. Early 20s. Marriage was economic. Not romantic. You married to form a household. To pool labor. To survive. Love was optional. Husbands were partners. Sometimes kind. Sometimes not. There were no illusions about equality. Men held legal authority. Women held responsibility. Which meant if something went wrong, it was usually your problem. Now let's talk about pregnancy. Because pregnancy was constant. Peasant women spent much of their adult lives either pregnant, recovering, or caring for children. Birth control didn't exist. Abstinence wasn't realistic. Childbirth was dangerous, painful, and common. Midwives helped. Sometimes. But many women gave birth at home. With family assistance. And a lot of hope. Infant mortality was high. Very high. Women lost children regularly. Which sounds emotionally devastating. And it was. But survival required a kind of emotional endurance that modern life doesn't demand. You mourned. Briefly. And then kept working. Because grief didn't feed anyone. Now let's talk about food. Peasant diets were repetitive. Bread. Porridge. Vegetables. Meat was rare. Reserved for festivals. Or special occasions. Hunger was familiar. Starvation was feared. Women managed food distribution. They knew how long supplies would last. How much could be spared. During bad harvests, women often ate less. So children could eat more. No speeches. No praise. Just quiet sacrifice. Now let's float toward illness. Medical knowledge was limited. Access to doctors was rare. Women relied on herbal remedies. Home treatments. Experience. They treated burns. Fevers. Cuts. And if someone died, they washed the body. Prepared it. Moved on. Because death was common. And rituals helped life continue. Now let's talk about time. Peasant women did not measure time in hours. They measured it in seasons. Spring was planting. Summer was labor. Autumn was harvest. Winter was survival. There was no retirement. No rest period. Old age didn't mean leisure. It meant lighter tasks. If you were lucky. Elderly women cared for grandchildren. Spun wool. Told stories. If you became too weak to work, life became very precarious. Now let's talk about religion. Religion was woven into daily life. Not as philosophy, but as structure. Church attendance was expected. Prayer was routine. Women prayed for healthy children. For good harvests. For endurance. Faith offered explanation. And comfort. Not because life was good, but because it needed meaning. Now let's pause. Because none of this was dramatic. There were no heroic arcs. No grand turning points. Just days. Stacked on days. On years. And peasant women lived entire lives this way. Unrecorded. Uncelebrated. Their names rarely appear in history. But their labor supported everything else. Castles. Kings. Wars. All built on their backs. And in the next part, we'll drift deeper. Into adolescence. Marriage negotiations. Community expectations. The small social rules that govern their lives. And the quiet consequences of breaking them. For now, let your thoughts drift. Because medieval peasant life wasn't loud. It was steady. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something calm, quiet, and gently uncomfortable in that very historical way. So go ahead and lower the lights. Let your shoulders drop. If you're holding your phone, you don't need to grip it like it owes you money. Just relax. Because tonight, we're talking about disabled people in ancient societies. Not the inspirational poster version. Not the heroic exceptions. Just the ordinary reality. Slow. Complicated. And very dependent on luck. Now, modern conversations about disability tend to be loud. Policy-heavy. Emotionally charged. Ancient societies, on the other hand, were much quieter about it. Not because they were enlightened, but because they didn't write much down unless you were rich, powerful, or causing a problem. Which already tells us something. In the ancient world, disability wasn't a single category. It wasn't labeled neatly. It wasn't medicalized. You weren't disabled. You were the man with the bad leg. Or the girl who doesn't speak. Or the child who never grew properly. And what happened to you depended almost entirely on where you were born, who your family was, and whether you could still be useful. Because usefulness, as always, was everything. Let's start very early. At birth. In many ancient societies, especially Greece and Rome, newborns were assessed almost immediately. Not lovingly. Practically. If a baby was born visibly disabled, the family faced a decision. And this is where things get uncomfortable in a very quiet way. In Sparta, which of course had opinions, infants were examined by elders. If a child was deemed too weak or malformed to become a soldier, they were often abandoned. Not ceremonially. Not dramatically. Just removed. Sparta didn't do sentiment. It did efficiency. Other Greek city-states were less formal, but the logic was similar. Raising a child required resources. Food. Time. Labor. If a child could never contribute, families sometimes chose exposure. Leaving the infant outside the city. On a hillside. At a crossroads. Not always to die. Sometimes to be taken in by someone else. Which sounds hopeful. And occasionally was. Some exposed children were rescued. Raised as servants. Or slaves. Not ideal. But alive. Now let's gently float over to Rome. Because Rome loved rules. Roman law gave the father absolute authority over newborns. If a child was visibly disabled, the father could legally reject it. This wasn't considered cruel. It was considered rational. Of course it was. But here's where things get interesting. Roman society also valued productivity deeply. And disability did not automatically mean uselessness. Blind people could memorize. Lame people could think. Deaf people could work. So while some infants were abandoned, others were kept. Especially if the family could afford it. Elite families, in particular, were more likely to raise disabled children. Not out of kindness, but because they had options. A disabled child in a wealthy household could become a scholar, a clerk, a household manager. Which brings us to an important point. Class mattered more than ability. Now let's move into childhood. Disabled children who survived infancy often lived very ordinary lives. Which is not the same as easy lives. They were expected to adapt. To contribute however they could. A child who couldn't work the fields might watch animals. Spin wool. Carry messages. There was no concept of accommodation. You simply found what worked. Or you didn't. Families were the primary safety net. If your family supported you, you survived. If they didn't, things got complicated. Some disabled children were sold into slavery. Not always cruelly. Just economically. A child who couldn't farm might still entertain. Or beg. Or serve. Slavery was Rome's universal solution. And disabled bodies were part of that economy. Now let's talk about adulthood. Because this is where the ancient world becomes less predictable. In ancient Greece, physical perfection was admired, celebrated, sculpted repeatedly, which meant visible disability could attract stigma. But intellectual disability was complicated. Philosophers loved talking about the ideal body. They also loved exceptions. Some disabled individuals were treated as curiosities. Others as fools. Others as wise. Because ancient societies were inconsistent like that. Now let's float into something quieter. Invisible disability. Chronic illness. Mental health. Epilepsy. Epilepsy, in particular, was fascinating to ancient people. Because they didn't understand it. Some believed seizures were divine. A sign of connection to the gods. Others thought they were demonic. Which, again, depended on context. An epileptic slave was dangerous. An epileptic priest was mysterious. Same condition. Different narrative. Mental illness was similarly fluid. Someone who heard voices might be seen as touched by the divine. Or as unstable. Or as inconvenient. It depended on how disruptive they were. Now let's gently move to Egypt. Because Egypt had a very different approach. Ancient Egypt did not idealize physical perfection in the same way Greece did. Their art shows people with dwarfism, limb differences, and other disabilities included in daily life. Not hidden. Not erased. Dwarfs, in particular, held respected positions. They worked in temples, at court, in crafts. Some were buried with honors. This wasn't equality, but it was inclusion. Egyptian religion emphasized balance, order, continuity. A body that was different wasn't necessarily wrong, just different, which is refreshing, historically speaking. Now let's drift toward Mesopotamia, where things were legalistic. Babylonian law codes mention disability frequently, usually in relation to compensation. If someone caused another person to become disabled, fines were assigned. If a worker was disabled on the job, outcomes depended on status. Again, class mattered. Disabled people could marry,